Hello and welcome to the introduction to the nervous system. The nervous system has a couple of general functions. Mainly it's there to collect information, process that information, and then act on that information. So there's specific receptors that detect stimuli from both the outside and inside universe, and they're going to send signals to the central part of the nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord then process that information and come up with some kind of response to that. There's going to be pathways that are going to take that decisive information and act on it using either muscles or glands. So the way the nervous system is organized, we've got the central nervous system, which is defined as the brain and spinal cord. We also have the peripheral nervous system, which are all the nerves and the ganglia that are outside of the central nervous system. We can also functionally divide the nervous system into two parts. There's the sensory nervous system, also known as the afferent nervous system. Afferent means toward a central location. So the sensory nervous system are all the pathways and signals taking sensory info from the body or from the outside universe and funneling that toward the central nervous system. Now, some of that we consciously detect, and that's referred to as the somatic sensory system. And then some of that we're not consciously aware of, and that is our visceral sensory system. Things like blood pressure and heart rate, respiration, levels of carbon dioxide in our blood. All those things are picked up and dealt with by the brain, but it's that visceral sensory system that processes that. And then we have the motor nervous system. This is efferent. Efferent means away from a central location. So the motor nervous system is going to take impulses from the central nervous system and take them to muscles, whether it's a skeletal muscle, which would be the somatic motor system, or an autonomic motor system, which is going to take the signal to either a smooth muscle or your cardiac muscles or glands. And then to further confuse things, the autonomic motor system is divided into both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, which we'll talk about more later. So here's a little organizational chart of the nervous system. We've got input coming in from the left, and that's sensory input from both our perceived and unperceived senses. It's processed by the central nervous system, and then some kind of decision is made, and those signals are then sent out. You'll notice it's not a back and forth arrow. This is a one-way system. The nerve pathways that take information are always one direction only. We're always going to send a signal on a neuron from the cell body down the axon and finish at the axon terminal. So our sensory nervous system and the motor nervous system, while right next to each other, use different pathways. A nerve is a bundle of axons that we find out in the peripheral nervous system. So nerves are wrapped up kind of like a cable. We've got the epineurium, which encloses the entire nerve. It's a thick layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's quite strong and resilient. The perineurium is a less dense connective tissue that wraps up bundles of axons, or what we call fascicles, that are within that nerve. And then finally, the endoneurium is a very, very thin layer of areolar connective tissue that we find wrapping up individual axons just above the myelination. It helps to separate and electrically insulate axons from each other. Nerves are pretty vascular. They do need blood. Blood vessels tend to travel through the center of nerves, and they will branch into capillaries and go and feed different fascicles and feed the perineurium and the epineurium. Here's a diagram of our nerve. You can see that it's like a big cable wrapped up. Little tiny wires are wrapped up into smaller cables, and then those smaller cables are wrapped up into one large cable. So just like we had our muscle with the epimysium, the paramysium, and the endomysium, we have the epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium. These axons that we see, these little tiny axons, are always sending a signal in one direction only. A ganglion is going to be a collection of neuronal cell bodies that are outside the central nervous system. We do have some special nerves. These go from the brain and drop down through holes in the skull, or some of them remain up in the skull. These are called cranial nerves. They do not go through the spinal cord. They exit the brain, and you have 12 pairs of them that kind of exit the ventral surface of the brain. And then your spinal nerves extend out from the spinal cord and go to your arms and your legs and your viscera. When we look at an overall nerve, remember this is a bundle of axons, we find that some of our nerves are purely sensory, some of them are purely motor, and some of them are mixed, meaning they contain both sensory and motor neurons. And you might be saying, wait, I thought neurons were only one way. Well, that's correct. Neurons are they only send their signals in one direction. But a nerve is a bundle of axons. Each neuron is sending its signal in one direction, but you can have two axons next to each other, one going one way, one going the other. It's kind of like the highway. If you look at traffic patterns on the highway, each lane has one direction, and it should be one direction only. But if you look at the overall highway, you can have two lanes next to each other, and one can go north and one can go south, and that's perfectly fine. So that's kind of the way it is with nerves. And remember, a ganglion is a cluster of neuronal cell bodies that we find in the peripheral nervous system. Now, neurons are the rock stars of nervous tissue. They're excitable, meaning they'll respond to stimuli. They're conductive, they can pass an electrical signal, and they secrete. They're going to release a neurotransmitter in response to activity that's happening on them. Neurons are typically extremely long-lived. They usually live just as long as the organism does. They are amitotic, meaning that after fetal development, you're not going to get any new ones. When we look at a specific neuron, we've got our cell body, the big kind of fried egg-looking shape, and the cell body, also called the soma, encloses the cytoplasm, called the perikaryon, and that contains the nucleus. Sometimes there'll be little dark staining areas that we call Nissl bodies in there. And then kind of surrounding the soma, we're going to have a lot of dendrites. These are short, unmyelinated processes that come off of the cell body, and they're the receptive area of the cell. Finally, part of that soma, or that cell body, is going to funnel out. It's going to taper into one really long axon. That axon is then going to go out somewhere into the body, or perhaps it's heading toward the brain if it's a sensory axon. But the axon part can be several inches or even several feet long. So these are the longest cells in the body. The cytoplasm is called the axoplasm when it's in the axon. The membrane is called the axolemma. The axon is going to sometimes split into little tiny filaments that are all running mostly parallel to each other, called axon collaterals. And on the tips of the telodendria are synaptic knobs, or boutons, and these contain our synaptic vesicles that have neurotransmitter in them. When we look at inside the neuron, we have a cytoskeleton. We've got microfilaments and intermediate filaments and microtubules like we do with most cells. The intermediate filaments are called neurofilaments, and they're going to kind of aggregate to form bundles called neurofibrils, and that provides a lot of tensile strength so that as a nerve is stretched, it's not likely to come apart. And here's a beautiful picture of a little neuron. We can see the kind of fried egg body up here in the middle. We've got our unmyelinated dendrites around that. These are our receptive area. And then here's our axon hillock where it tapers up, and then it proceeds into the axon itself. And we're going to split right here. These are the telodendria, each one ending in a little tiny synaptic knob that can release neurotransmitter. If we look at it on a histology stain, this great big cell is going to be our neuron. Huge nucleus right here. Here's our axon hillock, along with the axon extending away from it. And then we've got some dendrites poking around here. And then all these other little tiny dots are going to be the nuclei of glial cells. Glial cells are the helpers in nervous tissue, kind of like the roadies to the neuron rock star.